Charleston in the spring of that year did not announce its hardship loudly. It rested beneath it. The city moved as it always had, but with its breath held. The war had altered the harbor first. Where merchant ships once waited in loose rows, hulls touching gently with the tide, there were now intervals of guarded water and iron order. The sounds of the docks continued, ropes rasping, wood creaking, men calling to one another, but each sound carried restraint. Nothing was casual anymore. Every movement existed under inspection. For the enslaved population, daily life narrowed rather than changed. Labor remained labor, orders remained orders, yet the margin for error thinned. A delayed response, a wandering glance, a moment of silence where obedience was expected, all carried greater risk. Patrols passed more often. Questions were asked more sharply. Names were called out at night that had not been called before. Robert Smalls rose before daylight, as he had for years. He did not mark the morning by the sun but by habit. The harbor smelled of damp timber and coal ash. He washed with water drawn from a shared barrel, dressed without haste, and stepped into the morning with the quiet posture expected of him. His work required visibility without presence. He was to be seen doing what was asked, and nothing more. The CSS Planter lay moored not far from the southern wharves. Its grey hull blended into the water when the light was low. Robert had known the vessel long enough that its shape felt familiar, even intimate, though ownership was never his to claim. He knew the sound of its engine before it started, the way its boards shifted when the tide turned, the slight delay between command and response at the wheel. He greeted it as one might greet a place rather than a possession. The white officers came aboard later. Their boots struck the deck with assurance. Their voices carried easily. They spoke of schedules, of transfers between batteries, of supplies to be moved before dusk. Their tone assumed obedience as a given. Robert listened, as he always did, without appearing to. His hands remained steady. His face remained neutral. The workday unfolded slowly. Coal was loaded. Lines were adjusted. Orders were repeated. The vessel moved from post to post within the harbor, delivering men and material to forts whose walls rose dark and heavy against the water. At each stop, Robert observed the same rituals, signals exchanged, brief inspections, nods of recognition between officers. The routines rarely varied, and when they did, it was noted. Below deck, the heat gathered early. The enslaved crew moved carefully in the confined spaces, aware of one another without speaking much. There was trust among them, but it was cautious trust, built over years rather than declared. Names were known. Histories were understood without being spoken aloud. They shared water when it was permitted. They shared silence when it was safer. Robert returned home in the evening when allowed. The quarters he shared with his wife and children were small and poorly ventilated, but they were theirs in the limited sense slavery permitted. Hannah managed the space with quiet efficiency. She spoke little when others were near. With Robert, she spoke plainly. They discussed the children, the day's work, the cost of food taken from wages that were never truly theirs. Their children slept early. Robert watched them longer than was practical. He did not speak of the harbor in detail, nor of the ship's movements, nor of what he noticed while at the wheel. Instead, he listened. Hannah described the city as she experienced it, the moods of the households where she worked. The rumors passed among women while floors were scrubbed and linens folded. Fear moved through those rumors slowly, like damp through brick. Sunday brought no rest, only a shift in labor. Church services for the enslaved were permitted under supervision. The sermons emphasized obedience. Robert listened without comment. He watched who stood near the doors. He noticed who was absent. He remembered which hymns were cut short when patrols grew impatient. The city itself seemed to tighten as the weeks passed. Barricades appeared where they had not been before. Signals were revised. Papers were demanded more often. The harbor guns were tested at irregular hours, the sound rolling through the streets and into the quarters where children woke crying and were quieted quickly. Robert remained what he had always been in appearance, a skilled wheelman, reliable, measured, unremarkable to those who believed such men could be unremarkable. Yet beneath that surface, he carried the accumulated weight of observation. He knew when officers grew careless. He knew when vigilance was performative rather than real. He knew which lights along the shore marked safety and which marked warning. There was no open talk of escape. Such talk invited ruin. There was instead a slow accounting of days, of conditions, of small allowances and tightening restrictions. The war did not offer hope directly. It offered instability. For men and women held in bondage, instability was dangerous, but it was also the only condition under which permanence might be broken. At night, when the harbor quieted and the planter rested against its moorings, Robert stood on deck when permitted and watched the water. The tide moved as it always had, indifferent to flags and fortifications. He did not yet act. He did not yet decide. He observed. He waited. He lived within the narrow boundaries allowed him, learning their edges with care, knowing that to misjudge them even slightly would mean not correction, but erasure. This was how life continued in Charleston then, not with constant violence, but with constant control, not with spectacle, but with pressure. Each day resembled the one before it closely enough to disguise the fact that something was shifting beneath them all. The first signs did not arrive with declarations or new laws posted on walls. They came as interruptions, small corrections imposed without explanation, a delay in permission, a question asked twice when once had always been sufficient. In Charleston, authority did not need to announce itself loudly. It functioned best when it suggested that it was everywhere and nowhere at once. Robert noticed the change first in the harbor routines. The planter's assignments became less predictable. Where once it ran on established circuits, moving supplies between known points, its schedule now shifted without warning. Orders arrived late and were altered midday. Officers seemed less confident in their own instructions, compensating by issuing them more sharply. The vessel would idle for hours under watch and then be ordered to move suddenly without preparation. Each change carried tension, though no one spoke of it directly. The inspections grew longer. A sentry who had once waved the planter through with a lantern now required verbal confirmation from the deck. Signals were checked twice. On one occasion, a minor discrepancy in the timing of a whistle brought the vessel to a full halt while officers conferred in low voices. Robert stood at the wheel, unmoving, his expression empty, while minutes stretched into something heavier. The error was not his, but he knew responsibility would not matter if suspicion took root. On shore, the city reflected the same tightening. Enslaved men hired out to the docks were recalled to their owners more frequently. Passes were demanded even of those long known to patrols. Hannah spoke of women questioned about errands they had performed for years without comment. The questions were framed politely, but politeness did not soften their intent. Each inquiry reminded its subject that familiarity offered no protection. Rumors moved through the enslaved community carefully, passed only where trust had already been established. There were accounts of men taken aside for questioning and returned hours later shaken and silent, of others who did not return at all. No charges were announced, no explanations offered. Absence itself became a warning. The war fed suspicion. Confederate officers spoke openly among themselves of spies and informants, of Union sympathizers hidden within the city. Their words carried disdain when referring to white civilians and cruelty when referring to the enslaved. It was assumed, without argument, that any breach of security must involve those with the least power. The logic required no proof. On the planter, authority manifested through Lieutenant Riley first. His demeanor shifted from indifferent to exacting. He corrected movements that had never drawn notice before. He ordered repeated drills of procedures already well known. When mistakes occurred, he lingered on them, demanding explanations he did not intend to accept. His gaze lingered longer on the enslaved crew than on his fellow officers. Robert responded as expected. He acknowledged instructions promptly. He did not offer explanation unless directly asked. He did not meet Riley's stare longer than courtesy required. Inside, he noted everything: the tone of the reprimands, the timing of inspections, the specific moments when scrutiny intensified, often following reports from other parts of the harbor. The first overt injustice occurred without spectacle. One of the crew, a man named Abraham, was accused of mishandling a line during a routine docking. The line had been frayed before it reached his hands. The fault lay with the equipment, not the man. Riley ordered him confined below deck for the remainder of the day and docked his wages for the week. There was no appeal. The punishment exceeded the offense by design. It served as demonstration rather than correction. No one protested. To protest would have invited worse. Abraham accepted the order without comment, his face unreadable. Later, below deck, he sat apart from the others, his posture rigid. The silence around him was deliberate. Comfort could be mistaken for defiance. That evening, Robert walked home under watchful eyes. Patrols passed more frequently through the streets. Their presence was not new, but their behavior was. They stopped men who had never been stopped before. They questioned women returning from work, though no infractions were cited. Children were ordered off streets earlier than usual. Hannah listened as Robert described the incident with Abraham, though he spoke carefully, omitting details unnecessary to understanding. She nodded once. She had heard of similar punishments elsewhere. She spoke of a woman dismissed from service without explanation after being questioned by an officer about her movements. The woman had not returned to her quarters that night. No one knew where she had been taken. Fear spread not as panic, but as adjustment. People altered their routes. They avoided gathering in groups. Conversations shortened. Names were spoken less often. The city trained its inhabitants to police themselves. On the planter, a new officer appeared one afternoon without announcement. He was introduced briefly, his name spoken once and not repeated. He observed more than he spoke. His questions, when asked, were indirect. He inquired about tides, about delays, about the reliability of certain men. He did not write anything down. His presence unsettled the crew more than Riley's hostility, for it suggested assessment rather than discipline. Robert answered when addressed, offering factual responses without elaboration. He noted the man's interest in procedures that intersected with harbor defenses. He noted when the officer's attention drifted, and to what. Nothing overt occurred, yet the tension deepened. Days later, a curfew was announced for the enslaved population. It was framed as a security measure. Enforcement was immediate. Those found outside after the appointed hour were detained. Hannah altered her schedule to ensure she returned earlier, though it meant losing small opportunities for extra work. The loss was felt, but accepted. Safety came before necessity. At church, the sermons grew harsher. Obedience was emphasized not as virtue, but as survival. The overseers stood closer to the congregation. Hymns were cut short. Prayer was hurried. The space that had once offered limited solace now reflected the same pressure found elsewhere. Robert continued his duties. He did not alter his behavior. Change would draw attention. Instead, he refined his observations. He noted which officers enforced new rules most eagerly. He noted which seemed uncertain, following orders rather than understanding them. He noted the intervals between patrols, the inconsistencies in enforcement, the moments when vigilance lapsed under fatigue. The injustice lay not only in punishment, but in assumption. Guilt was presumed. Innocence was irrelevant. Each enslaved person was treated as a potential threat, not because of action taken, but because of existence. The war provided justification, but the impulse predated it. One evening, as the planter returned from a late assignment, Robert observed a brief exchange between two officers near the gangway. Their voices were low, their posture tense. The word example was used. He did not know its context, but he understood its implication. Authority sought not merely compliance, but submission reinforced through fear. The following day, a dockworker unaffiliated with the planter was arrested within sight of the harbor. He was accused of passing information. No evidence was presented. He was taken away quickly. The crowd dispersed without comment. Silence protected those who remained. That night, Robert sat with Hannah in near darkness, the children asleep beside them. Neither spoke for some time. The injustice was no longer abstract. It pressed against their lives directly. Hannah finally said what neither had voiced aloud before, that waiting carried its own danger. Robert did not answer immediately. He understood the truth of her words. He also understood the cost of action. Outside, the harbor lights flickered in the distance. The city held itself in a posture of control, tightening its grip even as cracks formed beneath the surface. The first signs had been subtle, but they were no longer ignorable. The balance between routine and repression had shifted. Fear now guided authority more than confidence, and fear, once introduced, rarely remained contained. Pressure did not arrive all at once. It accumulated, layer by layer, until ordinary actions required calculation and silence itself became deliberate. Charleston adjusted to this pressure without ceremony. Shops opened and closed as before. Ships still moved in and out of the harbor. Bells rang on schedule. Yet beneath the surface order, the city's rhythm had changed. It no longer breathed freely, it measured itself. For the enslaved population, the margin between compliance and punishment narrowed further. New instructions were issued verbally, rarely written, allowing them to shift without record. One day a pass would suffice. The next day it would not. Men and women learned to anticipate changes rather than rely on consistency. Those who failed to anticipate were corrected publicly, not because correction was necessary, but because fear required demonstration. On the planter, authority asserted itself through repetition. Orders already understood were restated. Movements already practiced were rehearsed again under watchful eyes. Lieutenant Riley's voice grew sharper, his patience thinner. He spoke often of discipline, though the word seemed to refer less to conduct and more to control. Mistakes, real or imagined, were documented and discussed among officers in the presence of the enslaved crew, as if to remind them that scrutiny was constant. Robert felt the pressure most acutely at the wheel. The harbor, once familiar in its routines, now felt crowded with observation. Signals were altered without notice. Checkpoints added. Patrol boats lingered longer than necessary. The planters' progress slowed, not because the channel was obstructed, but because authority required hesitation. Each delay invited inspection. Each inspection invited suspicion. The other enslaved crewmen responded in different ways. Some withdrew, speaking only when spoken to. Others attempted to demonstrate obedience through exaggerated attentiveness, though such efforts often drew ridicule rather than approval. No approach offered protection. Pressure did not reward compliance. It demanded it endlessly. On shore, the city mirrored the harbor's tightening grip. Curfews were enforced more strictly. Patrols entered quarters unannounced, claiming searches for contraband or information. No resistance was offered. Resistance would have been used as justification. Instead, people stood aside, watched their few possessions examined, and waited for permission to resume living. Hannah altered her routines again. She avoided certain streets altogether. She left work earlier when possible, even if it meant returning before her tasks were finished. Employers noticed and reprimanded her, but she accepted their disapproval. Safety had become the greater concern. She spoke less when others were near. At home, she spoke plainly but quietly. The children sensed the change without understanding it. They were instructed not to wander, not to speak to strangers, not to ask questions in public. Their world contracted. Robert watched this contraction with growing unease. Childhood, already limited by circumstance, shrank further under the weight of suspicion. Rumors circulated of new regulations being considered. Some spoke of restricting movement between wharves. Others mentioned the reassignment of enslaved laborers to inland work camps, away from the harbor. No announcements were made, but uncertainty itself became a form of control. People prepared for changes they could not see, exhausting themselves in anticipation. On the planter, a new practice emerged. White officers began remaining aboard overnight more frequently. Shore leave was shortened. Cabins were checked before departure. The enslaved crew was confined to specific areas of the vessel after hours. These measures were described as temporary. Temporary measures, Robert had learned, rarely were. One evening, as the vessel lay moored after a long day, Robert overheard a conversation between two officers near the stern. They spoke of tightening security before something went wrong. The phrase was vague, but the tone was not. It carried expectation, not caution. Robert understood then that authority was no longer reacting to threats. It was anticipating them. Lieutenant Abernathy's presence became more noticeable during this period. He did not issue harsh orders. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he observed. He asked questions framed as curiosity rather than command. He inquired about currents, about delays at certain checkpoints, about the reliability of specific signals. His manner contrasted sharply with Riley's aggression. Where Riley imposed, Abernathy assessed. Robert responded to Abernathy as he did to all officers, with respect and brevity, yet he noted the difference. Abernathy listened. He did not interrupt. When answers were given, he appeared to consider them rather than dismiss them. This did not inspire trust. It inspired caution of a different kind. The pressure affected even the white population, though its consequences differed. Merchants complained quietly of delays. Shipowners grumbled about inspections. Officers spoke among themselves of incompetence in other departments. Frustration circulated, but it did not threaten their safety. For the enslaved, frustration carried weight. It could be interpreted as defiance. One afternoon, an argument broke out on the docks between two officers over responsibility for a delayed shipment. Voices rose. Accusations were exchanged. When the argument ended, blame settled not on either officer but on a dock laborer who had been nearby. He was accused of distraction. He was struck once and removed from the area. The officers resumed their discussion as if nothing had occurred. The incident reinforced what everyone already knew. Pressure traveled downward. Robert's internal calculations grew more frequent. He did not yet consider action. He considered possibility. He reviewed routines in his mind. He noted which rules were enforced strictly and which inconsistently. He observed that increased control often produced oversight. The more procedures imposed, the more fatigue crept into enforcement. At night, sleep came in fragments. The harbor's sounds carried farther in the quiet. A whistle in the distance could signal routine or alarm. It was impossible to know without context, and context was increasingly withheld. Robert lay awake listening, not because he expected something to happen immediately, but because he sensed that conditions were shifting toward inevitability. Hannah sensed it too. She did not press him with questions. Instead, she asked practical ones. What would happen if work at the harbor ceased? Where would families be sent if labor was reassigned? These were not speculative questions. They were preparations. Robert answered cautiously, aware that certainty was impossible. The pressure reached a new level when a directive was issued requiring all harbor workers to be accounted for at the beginning and end of each day. Names were recorded. Times were noted. Absences were questioned. This record-keeping introduced permanence where there had been flexibility. It reduced the spaces where people might exist unnoticed. For Robert, whose safety depended in part on being unremarkable, this development was significant. Visibility increased. The margin for invisibility narrowed. He recognized this not as an isolated measure, but as part of a broader tightening that would continue until something broke. The city did not erupt. It did not descend into chaos. It simply compressed. Pressure built in silence, reinforced by routine, justified by war, and enforced without apology. For those with power, it was a precaution. For those without, it was a warning. By the end of that period, the sense of waiting had changed. It was no longer passive. It was charged. Something irreversible did not yet occur, but the conditions for it were being constructed carefully, methodically, without concern for those who would bear the cost. The moment did not announce itself as a turning point. There was no single sound or sight that declared the boundary had been passed. Instead, it revealed itself through consequence. Something occurred that could not be undone, not because it was dramatic, but because it altered the terms under which life continued. It began with a routine assignment that was not routine in its execution. The planter was ordered to make a late transfer between two harbor batteries, a movement that had been postponed twice earlier in the week. The delay was unexplained. When the order finally came, it arrived abruptly and carried an urgency that felt artificial. The officers spoke sharply. The crew was assembled without notice. Robert noted the timing immediately. Late movements had become rarer as security tightened. When they occurred, they were accompanied by heightened scrutiny. Yet this order came with fewer inspections than expected. The contradiction unsettled him. Pressure had taught him to distrust both severity and leniency when they appeared without cause. As the planter moved through the harbor under low light, Robert felt the familiar tension return, sharpened by fatigue rather than fear. The checkpoints passed without incident, though the sentries appeared distracted. Signals were exchanged quickly. No delays were imposed. It was as if the harbor itself had been instructed to look away. At the second battery, the transfer proceeded slowly. Supplies were offloaded. Orders were signed. During the process, a young enslaved laborer from another vessel was brought aboard briefly to assist. His presence was unremarkable until he hesitated while stepping onto the deck. The hesitation lasted no more than a moment, but it was enough. Lieutenant Riley noticed. He demanded an explanation. The boy did not answer immediately. His silence was not defiance, it was confusion. Riley struck him once hard across the face. The sound carried across the deck. Work stopped. No one intervened. Intervention would have escalated the situation beyond control. The boy was removed shortly afterward, his face already swelling. No record was made of the incident. It was treated as correction rather than assault. Yet the act marked a shift. Violence, once calculated and selective, had become impulsive. Authority no longer bothered to justify itself, even internally. Robert continued his duties without visible reaction. Inside, he noted the change. Riley's behavior was no longer strategic. It was reactive. Such behavior increased risk for everyone, including those who wielded power. Unpredictability destabilized routine, and routine was the foundation upon which control rested. The return trip was quiet. No one spoke. The engines hummed steadily. The harbor lights reflected off the water in broken patterns. When the planter docked, the officers disembarked without comment. The enslaved crew was dismissed later than usual, kept aboard while paperwork was reviewed unnecessarily. By the time Robert reached home, Hannah was waiting. She had heard of the incident already. News traveled quickly when it involved pain. She described how the boy's mother had been turned away from the quarters where he was being held. No explanation was given. The woman had been warned not to return. That night sleep did not come. The incident replayed in Robert's mind not because of its brutality, but because of its casual nature. It revealed something fundamental. Authority was no longer concerned with maintaining the appearance of order. It was asserting dominance openly, without restraint. The following days confirmed this shift. Inspections intensified again, but now they were accompanied by overt threats. Officers spoke openly of punishment. Names were recorded more carefully. Conversations were interrupted. Questions were asked with the expectation that they would not be answered fully. One morning, a man from the docks was accused of withholding information. No evidence was presented. He was taken from his work and confined within sight of others. He remained there for hours, exposed to the heat and to observation. The message was clear. Compliance was no longer sufficient. Submission was required. On the planter, Lieutenant Abernathy observed these developments with visible detachment. He did not intervene. He did not condone. He watched. His questions became more pointed, though still framed as curiosity. He asked Robert about response times at certain checkpoints, about which sentries were most consistent. The questions were not accusatory, they were precise. Robert answered carefully. He understood that information itself was no longer neutral. To share too much invited suspicion. To share too little invited the same. He offered facts that could be verified easily, nothing more. Abernathy listened without reaction, his expression unreadable. The line was crossed definitively one afternoon when a new directive was announced aboard the planter. Enslaved crew members were to be confined to the vessel overnight during certain operations. The measure was justified as security. In practice, it meant separation from families without notice or guarantee of duration. The announcement was delivered without discussion. No questions were permitted. The order took effect immediately. That evening, Robert remained aboard while Hannah returned home alone with the children. The separation was not violent. It was administrative. That made it more dangerous. Below deck, the air was stale. The men spoke little. Each understood the significance of the change. This was not temporary inconvenience. It was escalation. Control had extended beyond labor into personal existence. The boundary between work and life had been erased. Robert lay awake listening to the sounds of the harbor. He thought of his children asleep without him present. He thought of Hannah navigating the city alone under curfew. The risk calculus shifted. Waiting, once a form of survival, now carried consequences of its own. The following morning, the order was lifted without explanation. No apology was offered. The temporary nature of the measure did not mitigate its meaning. It demonstrated that authority could impose separation at will, that knowledge could not be unlearned. The incident spread through the enslaved community quickly. Fear deepened, but so did resolve. People spoke less, but they thought more. The understanding took hold that conditions were not merely worsening, but accelerating towards something final. For Robert, the line crossed was not the strike, nor the confinement, nor the separation alone. It was the realization that the system no longer required stability to function. It was willing to sacrifice order for dominance. In such an environment, predictability vanished. Survival through routine became untenable. That evening, Robert stood again on the deck of the planter, looking out over the water. The harbor remained unchanged in appearance. Fortifications stood as before. Signals flashed. Patrols moved steadily. Yet beneath that surface continuity, something essential had shifted. He did not yet act, but the conditions that had once restrained him, hope that restraint might return, belief that waiting preserved safety, had eroded. The line crossed was internal as much as external. The calculation changed. Risk was no longer a future possibility. It was present, imposed, unavoidable. From that point forward, whatever occurred would unfold under a different logic. The balance between endurance and action had tipped. The consequences, once hypothetical, had become immediate. The city continued its routines, but for those who understood what had changed, routine now concealed urgency rather than stability. Resistance did not begin with action. It began with attention. Under conditions where speech invited punishment and movement invited suspicion, observation became the only available response. For Robert, resistance took the form it always had, sharpened now by necessity rather than patience. He did not alter his demeanor. Any visible change would have been noted. Instead, he refined what he already did. He listened more carefully to tone than to words. He watched hands as much as faces. He noted not only which orders were given, but which were repeated and which were allowed to lapse without enforcement. These patterns mattered. In a system built on control, inconsistency revealed stress. On the planter, routine resumed its outward shape, but the undercurrent had changed. Officers spoke of security with less certainty. New measures were introduced, then quietly abandoned. Patrol schedules shifted without explanation. Each adjustment suggested reaction rather than confidence. Robert kept these observations to himself. Sharing them openly would have served no purpose and invited danger. Instead, he committed them to memory. His mind, long trained by necessity to retain detail without record, became a ledger. He noted the times when certain sentries appeared fatigued. He noted which checkpoints relied more on ritual than verification. He noted when authority assumed compliance rather than confirming it. This attention extended beyond the harbor. In the city, Hannah continued to gather information indirectly. She listened while working, her silence encouraging others to speak freely in her presence. She heard of households where officers argued openly about assignments, of shortages masked by confident rhetoric, of resentment growing among men tasked with enforcing rules they did not fully understand. At home, Robert and Hannah spoke cautiously, even in private. They assumed walls could carry sound, that neighbors might be questioned. Their conversations focused on practical matters, but beneath those discussions ran a current of shared awareness. Each understood that knowledge itself was becoming a form of leverage, though it could not yet be used. Quiet resistance also took the form of preservation. Robert made a deliberate effort to remember names, faces, and incidents that others might prefer to forget. He remembered the boy struck on the deck. He remembered the man confined in the heat. He remembered the woman turned away from her child. These memories were not weapons yet, but they were evidence. They resisted erasure. Among the enslaved crew, subtle forms of mutual support emerged. Water was shared when permitted. Tasks were adjusted quietly to spare those who had been singled out previously. Warnings were conveyed without words, a pause, a glance, a delay timed to divert attention. These acts did not challenge authority directly. They undermined its ability to isolate. Lieutenant Abernathy continued his pattern of observation. His questions grew more specific, though never overtly incriminating. He asked Robert about the effects of recent changes on efficiency. He asked whether delays at certain points had increased. He asked which procedures seemed most burdensome to the crew. The questions were framed as concern for performance, but their focus revealed something else. He was assessing stress points. Robert answered with measured honesty. He did not embellish. He did not conceal facts easily confirmed. He did not volunteer conclusions. Abernathy appeared satisfied, though his satisfaction was not reassuring. It suggested that Robert's answers aligned with expectations formed elsewhere. One evening, while cleaning the pilot house after officers had disembarked, Robert noticed papers left unsecured on a desk. He did not touch them. He did not read them fully. He noted their presence, their headings, their casual exposure. Such carelessness, if intentional, carried implications he was not prepared to confront directly. He restored the room to order without comment. The quiet resistance extended to endurance itself. Robert continued to perform his duties with precision. Excellence, under these conditions, became subversive. It denied authority the justification it sought for further punishment. It complicated narratives of incompetence or defiance. Yet excellence also increased reliance, and reliance created opportunity. At church, the sermons remained severe. Overseers watched closely. Still, in the pauses between hymns, brief exchanges occurred, looks held a moment longer than necessary, hands clasped slightly tighter. Faith, stripped of comfort, became a means of recognition rather than consolation. The children were instructed more carefully than before. Robert taught them to observe without staring, to listen without repeating, to remember without asking questions aloud. These lessons were not framed as preparation for action, but as preparation for survival. He did not know how long they would need such skills, but he knew they would need them. Time passed unevenly. Some days stretched under scrutiny, others slipped by under the illusion of calm. Throughout, Robert maintained his internal record. He began to sense not just individual weaknesses, but systemic ones. Authority, strained by war and suspicion, was beginning to rely on habit rather than verification. Habit could be predicted. The resistance remained quiet because it had to. Any visible challenge would have been crushed immediately, but beneath the surface, a shift was occurring. The enslaved were not merely enduring, they were noticing, they were remembering, they were adjusting their understanding of what was possible. Robert did not yet know how or when action would occur. He did not frame his observations as a plan. He framed them as readiness. The distinction mattered. Planning assumed control. Readiness acknowledged uncertainty. Late one night, as the planter rested against its moorings and the harbor lay still, Robert stood alone on deck for a moment longer than necessary. He looked out over the water, its surface broken only by reflected lights and slow-moving currents. The harbor remained a place of confinement, but it was also a place of passage. The quiet resistance he practiced did not promise success. It did not guarantee safety. It offered only one thing: the refusal to be reduced entirely to reaction. In observing, remembering, and enduring with intention, Robert preserved a measure of agency that authority could not easily detect. This resistance did not announce itself. It accumulated, unnoticed by those who believed control complete. It waited, as he waited, for conditions to align not with hope, but with necessity. When authority felt its footing weaken, it did not concede error. It denied the ground had shifted at all. In Charleston, denial took the form of procedure. New rules were framed as refinements. Punishments were described as corrections. Disruptions were attributed to rumor, incompetence, or enemy interference that could be contained with sufficient firmness. After the incidents that had unsettled the harbor workforce, Confederate command issued reassurances without addressing specifics. Officers repeated phrases about order and vigilance. They insisted that security was intact, that discipline had been restored. The repetition itself suggested otherwise. Confidence, when genuine, rarely needed reinforcement. On the planter, this denial became visible in the contrast between words and practice. Official directives emphasized strict adherence to protocol, yet enforcement varied widely. Some sentries followed new rules rigidly. Others ignored them when it suited convenience. Officers contradicted one another openly, then denied doing so. The system relied increasingly on appearance rather than coherence. Robert observed this carefully. Institutional denial did not erase problems, it displaced them. Responsibility flowed downward. When delays occurred, blame settled on laborers. When signals were missed, fault was assigned to inattentiveness rather than confusion. Each denial preserved authority by sacrificing credibility. Lieutenant Riley embodied this pattern most clearly. His outbursts became more frequent, his punishments harsher, yet his explanations thinner. He framed every act of force as necessary, every complaint as subversion. When confronted indirectly by fellow officers about declining efficiency, he dismissed concerns as weakness. He did not adapt, he doubled down. Abernathy, by contrast, remained composed. He participated in meetings where reassurances were issued. He nodded at conclusions that did not align with observable reality. His silence during these moments was conspicuous. He neither challenged nor endorsed the official narrative. He allowed it to stand, intact and brittle. The enslaved community felt the effects of this denial immediately. Complaints, once occasionally acknowledged, were now dismissed outright. Petitions were ignored. Questions were reframed as evidence of disloyalty. The system no longer sought to correct itself. It sought to preserve its image. One afternoon, a minor accident occurred on the docks. A crate slipped during unloading and struck a worker's leg. The injury was visible. The cause was obvious. The equipment had been worn beyond safe use. An officer arrived and declared the incident the result of carelessness. The equipment was not replaced. The worker was removed and reprimanded. The record reflected no fault in supply or oversight. This pattern repeated. Problems were isolated to individuals. Systems remained blameless. The war provided cover for this approach. Shortages, delays, and errors were attributed to external pressure. Internally, no adjustments were made. Robert's role placed him close to this machinery of denial. He heard officers discuss reports that bore little resemblance to events he had witnessed. He watched them sign documents attesting to conditions that no longer existed. He understood that these records would outlast the moment. They would become the official account. This understanding altered his perception of risk. It was no longer enough to survive events themselves. Survival now required recognition that truth, once suppressed, might never be acknowledged unless carried forward deliberately. Silence, under these conditions, became complicity by default. Abernathy's questions resumed, though less frequently. When they occurred, they were framed around discrepancies. He asked about delays that reports claimed had not happened. He asked whether certain measures had produced the intended results. His inquiries suggested awareness of the gap between record and reality. Robert answered carefully. He did not contradict official accounts directly. He described conditions without assigning blame. He spoke of effects rather than causes. Abernathy listened, his expression unreadable. He did not challenge Robert's statements. He did not record them. He absorbed them. The denial extended beyond the harbor. In the city, public notices spoke of unity and resolve. Punitive measures increased even as officials claimed stability. Patrols intensified in areas already heavily monitored. The appearance of control became more important than its effectiveness. Hannah reported similar patterns in the households where she worked. Employers spoke confidently of victory while hoarding supplies. They dismissed rumors of unrest even as they reinforced locks and restricted movement. The contradiction was not acknowledged, it was lived. For the enslaved, institutional denial closed remaining avenues of redress. There would be no correction through appeal, no relief through explanation. Authority had committed itself to its version of reality, and that commitment required the suppression of all others. Robert recognized this as a narrowing of options. When institutions deny reality, change does not occur through persuasion. It occurs through disruption or exposure, often unintentionally. He did not yet know what form that would take. He knew only that waiting for acknowledgement was no longer viable. The harbor continued to function, but with increasing strain. Errors multiplied, fatigue spread, officers rotated frequently, disrupting continuity. Each change was framed as improvement. None addressed the underlying fractures. Institutional denial did not stop events from unfolding. It ensured that when truth emerged, it would do so abruptly, without preparation, and with consequences beyond those originally denied. Robert sensed this not as prophecy, but as pattern. He had seen smaller versions of it before, on plantations and in households, where refusal to acknowledge injustice preceded its escalation. As he stood again at the wheel, guiding the planter through familiar waters under altered conditions, Robert understood that the system now depended on his invisibility more than ever. It assumed his compliance, his silence, his absence from the record. In that assumption lay its vulnerability. The denial was complete. Authority had sealed itself off from correction. What remained was time, pressure, and the inevitability that comes when truth is deferred too long. Truth did not surface all at once. It did not arrive with confession or acknowledgement. It emerged through accumulation, through the quiet convergence of record and memory, through moments when denial could no longer contain what had been deferred. In Charleston, this surfacing began not with exposure, but with misalignment. The harbor's routines faltered first. Delays multiplied beyond explanation. Vessels missed expected windows. Signals were exchanged correctly and still questioned. Officers blamed one another in private, then denied disagreement in public. The machinery of control, strained by its own contradictions, began to show its seams. Robert felt this acutely at the wheel, where once he could anticipate each checkpoint with confidence, now he encountered inconsistency. A sentry would demand verification one night and wave the vessel through the next. Signals recently emphasized were suddenly ignored. Orders issued in the morning were reversed by evening. These were not strategic adjustments. They were symptoms of a system losing coherence. The enslaved crew noticed as well. Their conversations remained cautious, but their awareness sharpened. They recognized that authority no longer operated from a unified understanding of its own rules. This did not lessen danger, it altered it. Uncertainty replaced predictability, and uncertainty invited mistakes. It was during this period that Lieutenant Abernathy's behavior shifted subtly. He spent less time aboard the planter, though his presence elsewhere in the harbor seemed to increase. When he did appear, his questions were fewer, but his attention more focused. He observed not just procedures, but reactions. He watched how officers responded to contradiction, how sentries handled confusion. Robert understood that Abernathy was no longer gathering information for internal use alone. His manner suggested preparation rather than assessment. Still, nothing was spoken directly. The line between observation and implication remained carefully unmarked. Truth surfaced first in fragments. A report circulated among officers describing a minor breach in harbor protocol. The description did not match the event as Robert remembered it. Key details were omitted. Others were altered. The report concluded with reassurances that corrective measures had been effective. Within days, a second report contradicted the first. Timelines differed. Responsibility shifted. Neither report acknowledged the discrepancy. Instead, each asserted completeness. The contradiction itself became evidence of denial's limits. The enslaved community sensed this shift indirectly. Patrols grew uneven. Enforcement faltered in some areas while intensifying irrationally in others. Authority no longer applied pressure with consistency. It reacted, often too late, to problems it refused to name. Hannah heard of officers arguing openly in households where she worked, not about the war's outcome, but about competence, about whether security measures were functioning or merely appearing to. These arguments ended abruptly when others entered the room. Silence followed, heavier than reassurance. The truth surfaced further when an officer was reassigned abruptly without explanation. His departure was noted but not discussed. Officially, it was routine. Unofficially, it unsettled those who relied on routine to mask instability. If reassignment could occur without record, then record itself was unreliable. Robert continued his work. He did not seek confirmation of his observations. He did not share conclusions. He allowed the pattern to reveal itself fully before assigning meaning. This patience was not passive. It was deliberate. Acting too early would have placed him within the system's capacity to suppress. The convergence came quietly. A night passage through the harbor proceeded without the expected inspections. Signals were exchanged mechanically without scrutiny. The sentries appeared tired, inattentive. The harbor's defenses, so loudly proclaimed, operated on assumption rather than verification. Robert understood then that truth had surfaced not as revelation, but as vulnerability. The system's insistence on its own perfection had created gaps it no longer monitored. These gaps were not created by resistance alone. They were created by denial. Abernathy appeared briefly the following day. He spoke little. When he did, his words were indirect. He remarked on how systems under strain often reveal their weaknesses unintentionally. He did not look at Robert when he spoke. He did not need to. Nothing was said aloud that could be repeated. Nothing was promised, yet understanding passed between them without acknowledgement. The truth, long deferred, now existed openly enough to shape behavior, even if it remained officially unspoken. For Robert, this moment did not bring relief. It brought clarity. The surfacing of truth did not guarantee justice. It guaranteed consequence. Once vulnerability existed, it would be exploited by someone, whether deliberately or accidentally. The question was no longer whether change would occur, but how violently. The harbor continued its operations. The city maintained its posture of control. Official records remained intact, yet beneath them, the accumulated weight of contradiction pressed outward. Truth, denied too long, had found its way into practice. Robert returned home that evening with a measured calm. He spoke little. Hannah did not press him. She sensed the shift without needing explanation. The children slept, unaware of the convergence forming around them. Truth had surfaced not as a declaration, but as a condition. It existed now in the spaces between orders and execution, between record and reality. It could no longer be fully contained. What followed would not be sudden. It would unfold as the consequence of what had already been set in motion. The system, having denied its fractures, would be unable to control how they widened, and those who had learned to observe in silence would recognize the moment not as opportunity, but as inevitability. After the truth surfaced, there was no immediate reckoning. Institutions rarely respond to exposure with clarity. They respond with delay. Charleston did not change overnight. The harbor continued to function. Orders continued to be issued. Patrols continued their circuits. On the surface, the city appeared intact. Yet the balance had shifted, and those who lived closest to its pressure felt the difference first. The departure of the planter occurred without announcement. No ceremony marked it. No explanation accompanied the order. On that morning, the vessel moved as it always had, its engines steady, its deck arranged according to habit. The white officers were absent, said to be delayed ashore. This absence was not unprecedented. It was merely noted. Robert took the wheel with the same posture he had maintained for years. Nothing in his manner suggested departure rather than routine. The harbor responded accordingly. Signals were exchanged. Whistles answered. Lanterns lifted and lowered in practice sequence. The defenses, confident in their procedures, recognized what they expected to see. When the vessel passed beyond the final checkpoint, no alarm sounded. The harbor did not react because it did not yet understand that anything had changed. By the time recognition followed assumption, distance had replaced proximity. Reaction lagged behind consequence. What followed in Charleston was confusion rather than acknowledgement. Officers disputed timelines. Reports were drafted and redrafted. Responsibility was assigned provisionally, then revised. Denial persisted, even as evidence mounted that something irreversible had occurred. Within the enslaved community, news spread cautiously. The event was not celebrated openly. Celebration invited attention. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that the system's certainty had been broken by its own assumptions. The harbor, long presented as impenetrable, had proven otherwise. The Confederate command responded as institutions often do when confronted with contradiction. Investigations were announced, new restrictions imposed, individuals were questioned, yet the focus remained on identifying fault rather than understanding cause. The deeper truth, that reliance on denial had produced vulnerability, was not addressed. Lieutenant Abernathy did not appear again. His absence was noted, then absorbed into the broader confusion. No official record explained his departure. No inquiry acknowledged his role. His name faded from routine mention, preserved only in memory and implication. Institutions protect themselves by erasing inconvenient complexity. Robert's journey did not end with passage beyond the harbor. Freedom did not arrive as resolution. It arrived as condition. Responsibility replaced bondage, bringing its own weight. He provided accounts of what he had observed, not framed as accusation, but as fact. His testimony aligned with records that could no longer fully conceal discrepancy. In time, official narratives simplified the event. They emphasized audacity and skill while minimizing context. Complexity was reduced. Causes were narrowed. This simplification made the story manageable but incomplete. Charleston adjusted. It always did. The harbor's routines were altered. Security measures were revised. The system learned partially from its failure, yet it did not confront the injustice that had made such failure possible. Control was restored without reflection. For those left behind, consequences unfolded unevenly. Some faced increased scrutiny. Others were reassigned or sold. The system punished broadly, unable or unwilling to isolate responsibility accurately. Innocence remained irrelevant. Robert's later life unfolded under a different form of visibility. He was no longer unseen. His words carried weight. Yet even then, he understood how easily truth could be shaped by record rather than memory. He spoke carefully. He documented when permitted. He remembered always. In quiet moments, he reflected not on triumph, but on cost, on the years spent observing rather than acting, on the line crossed not by a single event, but by accumulation, on the knowledge that institutions rarely fall because they are challenged directly. They falter because they refuse to see themselves clearly. The harbor remained. The tides continued. Charleston endured. The system that had denuded its fractures persisted in altered form, carrying forward both its authority and its unresolved contradictions. The aftermath was not justice, it was consequence. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, without closure. History recorded what it could. Memory preserved what record omitted. In the end, what remained was not celebration, but understanding. That power maintained through denial creates the conditions of its own undoing. That silence, when chosen deliberately, can preserve truth long enough for it to surface. And that even when institutions refuse to acknowledge injustice, its effects do not disappear. They move forward, carried by those who were forced to learn its weight and who survived long enough to remember.